Hey guys, tonight we explore the part of the story that nobody tells together, as we begin the morning after Odysseus came home. The suitors were dead, the palace was cleaned, the bed had been recognized, the reunion had happened. And then everyone woke up, and nobody knew quite what to do next. If you have watched our Trojan War video and our Odyssey video, welcome back. This is the third part of the story, the part that comes after the ending, the part that is, in many ways, the hardest. And if this is your first time here, you don't need the other two videos to follow this one, because this story is not really about ancient Greece. It is about what happens to any person, in any life, when the thing they have been waiting for finally arrives. And what arrives is not what they expected. Right now, as you're watching this, someone else is watching it too. A different country, a different time zone, a different life, but the same quiet hour. Tonight we explore the morning after, what comes when the hero finally comes home. Together. If this is your first video here, take a look around, subscribe if it feels like home, and leave a comment your location, your time. That small act of saying, "I'm here," does something. It reminds all of us that we're not as alone in this as the dark sometimes makes us feel. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself if there's one nearby. Let's begin. Every story has a shape, and the shape of the Odyssey, the shape that Homer gave it, the shape that 3,000 years of retelling has reinforced, ends with the reunion, the recognition at the bow, the slaughter of the suitors, the test of the bed, Penelope weeping, Odysseus weeping, 20 years collapsing into one night. And then, in the final lines of the poem, Athena brings peace to Ithaca, and the enemies of Odysseus are made to forget their grievances, and a kind of divine order is restored. The end. Except it isn't the end. It's just where the poem stops. Because the morning after that reunion, the first ordinary morning of Odysseus's return, is not in the poem. And neither is the week after, or the month, or the year. And those are the parts that interest me tonight. Not the extraordinary, the hero returning, the bow drawn, the recognition, the reunion, but the ordinary that came after all of that. The breakfast, the conversation that didn't quite land, the moment when Penelope looked across the table at the man she had waited 20 years for and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Distance. Not because she didn't love him. She did. She had loved him for 20 years, with a ferocity and a constancy that had survived suitors and grief and uncertainty and the very real possibility that he was dead. But she had also spent 20 years becoming someone, and that someone was not the woman who had watched him sail away. That someone was harder and more complete and more fully herself than she had ever been when he was there. And now he was back, and nobody had a script for what came next. Let's stay with Penelope for a long time, because she is the most underwritten character in one of the most written about stories in history. We know her through her waiting, the faithful wife, the clever weaver, the woman who unraveled her work each night to buy more time. Patient, constant, loyal. And all of that is true, but it is the smallest part of what is true. Penelope ran Ithaca for 20 years, not in the background, not as a placeholder for Odysseus's eventual return, but as the actual functioning authority of an island kingdom under extraordinary pressure. She managed the household. She managed the politics. She managed a palace full of over 100 men who were eating her food and drinking her wine and pressing her daily to choose one of them, which would have meant surrendering not just her faithfulness to Odysseus, but her authority, her position, and the inheritance of her son. She held all of it, every day, for 20 years. The weaving trick is usually told as a simple story of cleverness. Unravel by night what you weave by day. Buy yourself time. But think about what it actually required to maintain that deception every single day for years. To go to sleep each night knowing you would have to undo your work. To get up each morning and begin again, knowing it was only ever delay, never resolution. To do this while managing a household full of hostile men, while raising a son alone, while carrying the grief of not knowing whether your husband was alive or dead. That is not waiting. That is endurance of a kind that deserves its own epic, and never got one. And then Odysseus came home, and the suitors were killed, and the palace was restored, and the man she had waited for was standing in her hall. And Penelope did not rush to him. This detail that Penelope hesitated, that she tested him, that she did not simply dissolve into relief and reunion, is the most psychologically honest moment in the entire poem, and it is almost always underread. She had been the authority here for 20 years. She had held this together through force of will and intelligence, and an iron refusal to be managed. And now a man had arrived, claiming to be her husband, and everyone in the hall believed him, and expected her to believe him too. She tested him instead, with the bed, the secret of the bed that only the two of them could know, because she understood something that the poem never quite articulates, but that is present in every line of her behavior. Trust, once broken by absence, even involuntary absence, even absence that wasn't his fault, has to be rebuilt. It cannot simply be resumed. The 20 years existed. They changed her. They changed him. And the reunion, however genuine and however moving, was not the end of that changing. It was the beginning of having to figure out what they had each become. The morning after the reunion, Penelope woke up next to a man she recognized and didn't quite know, and she had to decide every day what to do with that. There is an ancient Greek philosopher, not Homer, but one of his contemporaries, who said something that applies to this story more precisely than he could have known. You cannot step into the same river twice. The river is always moving. The water that was there when you first stepped in is already gone, and you yourself are not quite the same person who stepped in the first time. Odysseus and Penelope had not seen each other for 20 years. 20 years is not an absence. It is a life. It is the span of time in which a child becomes an adult, in which a person's parents age and die, in which the body changes, the face changes, the things that matter change, the things that are bearable change, the things that are no longer bearable change. Odysseus had been to war. He had watched men die. He had made decisions that cost lives. He had been to the underworld and spoken with the dead. He had been offered immortality and chosen mortality. He had been changed, at the deepest level, by 20 years of extraordinary experience. Penelope had been through something entirely different and equally transforming. 20 years of ordinary, extraordinary life. The daily grind of survival, of management, of endurance. The small victories and the small humiliations and the large loneliness and the slow, imperceptible process of becoming someone who can handle almost anything because she had to. When they lay in that bed together on the first night of his return, they were not the same two people who had shared it before he left. They were strangers with a shared history. And that is a very particular and very strange thing to be. Not enemies, not simply lovers reunited, but two people who had lived an entire life in the same world and not the same world. who carried 20 years of separate experience into a room and had to figure out how to be together in it. The poem ends there, but the actual work begins there. Telemachus was a baby when Odysseus left. He did not remember his father. He grew up with a gap where a father should have been, not just emotionally, but practically, structurally, in terms of how the household worked and who was in charge, and what the future was supposed to look like. He grew up, instead, with a mother who was extraordinarily capable and strong and entirely present, and with the suitors, 100 men who occupied his father's house and ate his father's food, and treated him, the son of the king, as an afterthought in his own home. This experience, growing up as effectively the man of the house, while simultaneously being treated as nobody, produced something complicated in Telemachus. On one hand, he developed the particular competence and seriousness of a person who was given adult responsibility too early. On the other, he carried the wound of not having been protected, of having been the child who needed a father and didn't have one. The goddess Athena visited him early in the poem and told him to go looking for his father, to sail to Pylos and Sparta, to ask Nestor and Menelaus if they had news of Odysseus. This journey is sometimes read as a minor digression before the main story, but it is actually one of the most important moments in the entire epic, because Telemachus went. He organized ships. He navigated foreign courts. He spoke to kings. He did all of this as a young man who had never been trained for any of it, by a father who wasn't there to train him. He became himself in his father's absence. And then Odysseus came home. And here is the thing nobody talks about. Telemachus had been the man of the house, and now there was a man in the house. The reunion between Odysseus and Telemachus is one of the most emotionally charged scenes in the poem. They wept together, the text says, and the sound was like birds whose young have been taken. The love is real. The relief is real. But love and relief do not resolve the structural question. Who is in charge now? Telemachus had been waiting for his father, and he had also, without quite realizing it, been becoming the person who didn't need him. Both things were true simultaneously, and the arrival of Odysseus required Telemachus to undo some of what he had built, to step back from the authority he had grown into, to make room for someone whose authority was theoretical but enormous, whose right to lead the household was undeniable and also had not been earned in front of Telemachus in any way he could see. This is the psychology of every child who grew up in the absence of a parent, and then had to accommodate their return. The love is not in question. The complexity underneath the love is not in question either. Now let's follow Odysseus himself into the morning after. He had been trying to get home for 10 years. He had faced monsters and gods and the pull of immortality. He had chosen mortality over divinity, Ithaca over paradise, Penelope over goddesses, a rocky, unremarkable island over every more beautiful alternative the world had offered him. He had done this because home was what he wanted most. And then he got there. And the first thing he discovered was that getting home was not the same as being home. Because being home requires being recognized. Not just in the dramatic sense, not just the test of the bed and the drawing of the bow, but in the daily sense, the ordinary sense. The sense in which the people around you know who you are, what you need, how you operate, what matters to you, what you find funny, when you need to be left alone. Penelope had known all of that, once, but she had known it about a man who sailed away 20 years ago. She was learning it again, for the first time, about someone who was the same man and not quite the same man. Telemachus had never known it at all. He was meeting his father for the first time as an adult. And Odysseus himself, the man who had spent 10 years being nobody, literally, having told the Cyclops his name was nobody, had to figure out who he was when he was finally allowed to be Odysseus again. Here is the psychological truth that no one quite says about Odysseus's return. He had been defined for 20 years by the journey, by the goal of getting home, by being the man trying to return. And when he arrived, when the goal was accomplished and the journey was over, he lost the thing that had organized his identity for 2 decades. He was home. He had won. And he didn't quite know what to do next. This is a very human experience. The person who works toward a goal for years and achieves it, and finds the achievement unexpectedly hollow, not because the goal wasn't worth it, but because the striving had become who they were. The runner who wins the race and doesn't know what to do with their mornings anymore. The parent whose child leaves home and suddenly has no one to organize their days around. Odysseus had been the man coming home for so long, and now he was just the man who was home. And he had to figure out, for the first time, what that meant. There is no ancient source that tells us what happened in the months after Odysseus returned. Homer ends the story. The later tradition fragments. What we know about the aftermath comes mostly from hints and references, and the occasional later work that picks up where Homer left off. But we can imagine it, because it follows the logic of the story and the logic of human experience, with a consistency that feels true even without documentation. The suitors were dead. That was a violent and necessary act that created its own aftermath. Grief among the families of the dead, resentment in Ithaca, a new political landscape that Odysseus had to navigate as a king who had been absent for 20 years and returned to kill 100 men. His relationship with Penelope did not simply resume. It had to be rebuilt, conversation by conversation, day by day, in the small, ordinary moments that the epic never records. The breakfast where he said something that landed wrong because he didn't yet know that she had changed. The evening where she was quiet in a way that he didn't understand yet and wasn't sure how to ask about. The slow, imperfect, genuinely difficult process of becoming known to each other again. His relationship with Telemachus required the same kind of patient, unhurried work. The handing back of authority that Telemachus had earned in the wrong order. The conversations where Odysseus tried to teach a son things the son had already learned, and had to recalibrate when he understood that. The gradual, mutual recognition that the relationship between them was not the father and infant that it had been when he left, but something new, between 2 men who were more similar than either of them had expected, and both had to figure out what to do with that. And Odysseus himself had to find a new organizing principle for his life. The journey was over. The war was done. The long wandering had ended. What did a man do whose entire adult life had been defined by an emergency, when the emergency was finally resolved? This is the real work of returning, not the dramatic, the test, the recognition, the reunion, the ordinary, the daily, the quiet, unglamorous, absolutely necessary work of building a life in a place you had been gone from for 20 years. Homer didn't write this part, but it happened. I want to make an argument tonight that I haven't heard made quite this way before. The Odyssey is usually read as a story about homecoming, about the journey home, about loyalty and cleverness, and the pull of home against the pull of everything else the world offers. And it is all of those things. But I think it is also, at its deepest level, a story about a question that Homer never quite asks directly. A question that lives underneath the entire narrative, that the story circles around without ever landing on. What do you do with yourself when the extraordinary is over? Odysseus was, for 20 years, in an emergency. The war, the wandering, the survival. Every day contained something that required the full application of everything he was: his intelligence, his courage, his endurance, his particular and extraordinary capacity for survival under impossible conditions. And then it was done. And the question that follows the end of every long emergency is the same question: whether the emergency is a war, or an illness, or a relationship that required everything you had, or a decade of building something, or a grief that reorganized your entire life. What now? Who am I when I am not defined by this? Odysseus, coming home to Ithaca, had to answer that question. The man who had been defined by his longing for home had to figure out who he was when home was no longer a longing, but a reality. When Penelope was not an idea, but a person having breakfast across from him. When Ithaca was not a destination, but just the place where he lived. And Penelope, receiving him, had to answer her own version of the same question. Who am I, now that the waiting is over? And Telemachus, the son who had become a man in the absence of his father, had to answer his. Who am I, now that the absence has ended? These are not ancient Greek questions. They are the questions that come after every significant chapter of a human life reaches its conclusion. I want to come very close to home now, before we move into the quiet, because the story of the morning after Odysseus's return is not just about Ithaca. It is about every person who has ever reached the end of something they had been working toward for a very long time, and found that the ending was not quite what they expected. Not worse, necessarily. Not a disappointment exactly. But different, more ordinary, more complicated, more genuinely, quietly demanding than the journey toward it had been. The relationship you fought to save and then had to figure out how to live in, now that it was saved. The career you worked toward for a decade and then had to inhabit, now that you were inside it. The grief you survived and then had to figure out who you were, now that the surviving was done. Every arrival contains a version of Odysseus's question, and every arrival contains a version of Penelope's. Because the people we love do not stop becoming people while we are away from them. They change, the way we change, in directions we didn't predict, at speeds we didn't expect, into versions of themselves that are real and complete, and not quite the person we were carrying in our memory. And coming home, really coming home, not just arriving, but genuinely inhabiting the place you came back to, requires being willing to meet that. To let the person in front of you be the person they actually became, rather than the person you were holding in your mind for the duration of the absence. To let yourself be the person you actually became, rather than the person they were expecting. To begin the slow, ordinary, absolutely necessary work of knowing each other again. Tonight, in whatever quiet you are lying in, think about the place you are trying to reach, the thing you are working toward, the person, or the life, or the version of yourself that lives at the end of the current journey. And know that when you get there, the real work begins, and that the real work is the gift. I want to speak very slowly now to whoever is still listening. The bed, the secret that Penelope used to test Odysseus. the bed that was built around a living olive tree, rooted in the earth, immovable. The secret that only the two of them knew is the most important object in the entire trilogy. Not the horse, not the bow, not Achilles' armor or Odysseus' spear. The bed. Because the bed is what survived. Everything else changed. Troy burned. The suitors died. 10 years of war and 10 years of wandering rewrote everyone involved beyond recognition. But the bed built into the living wood, rooted in the actual earth of Ithaca, was still there. And Odysseus knew it, and Penelope knew it. And in that shared knowing, in the thing that had not changed when everything else had, they found each other. This is what the story has been about all along. Not the journey, not the destination, not even the reunion. The root. The thing that is still there after 20 years. The part of a person, or a love, or a life, that survives everything that is thrown at it. Not because it is invulnerable, but because it is genuinely, deeply, in the ground. You have your own olive tree bed somewhere. The thing that persists. The thing that would still be there if you went away for 20 years and came back. The thing that, when you finally name it, when you finally describe the secret only you could know, the other person recognizes immediately. Not everything survives. Not everything should. 20 years changes things, and some of those changes are losses, and some of them are growth, and some of them are simply time doing what time does. But some things are built into the living wood, and those things quietly, stubbornly, without drama, hold. Tonight, let yourself think of yours. Not anxiously, not trying to figure out what it is or whether it's still there. Just let it be present, the way the bed was present in the palace all those years, rooted and patient and waiting to be the evidence of something real. Let your breathing slow. Let the long journey of today settle into rest. You have been traveling. You are allowed to be, just for tonight, arrived. Let the root hold you, and rest. If this reached you tonight, leave a comment. Just your city and the time. This is the third part of our Trojan War and Odyssey trilogy. If you haven't seen the first two, the story of how the war began, and the story of the journey home, they are waiting for you on this channel. And if you want more nights like this one, subscribe. We're here every Monday and Thursday. Same quiet place, same honest voice. Good night, wherever you are.